Welcome everyone to this webinar on how to avoid damage from flooding. Our speaker today is Ned Swanberg, and I will introduce him in a minute. My name is Aude Locher. I am the Water Resources Educator with Lake Champlain Sea Grant. And my partner in crime today is Gary Dizil. So he's going to do a lot of behind the scene work. If you are not familiar with Sea Grant, we are a collaboration between the University of Vermont and SUNY Plattsburgh. And we are dedicated to the protection and sustainable use of Lake Champlain through outreach, education, and research. One of our areas of interest is to help municipal officials and other municipal leaders build resilient communities and economies. So if you want to sign up for our newsletter, or if you want to know what Sea Grant is up to, feel free to check out the link that Gary is going to post in the chat, uvm.edu Sea Grant News. So this webinar is the second in a series of webinars to share information with you all about how to adapt and recover from extreme weather events such as flooding. A couple of housekeeping items here. You are in a webinar, so you are in listen-only mode. You cannot speak unless I allow you to use your microphone. If you have any questions for our speaker today, I would like to encourage you to use the Q&A box, which is indicated by the red arrow on the slide here. You'll be able to, if you see that someone has posted a question that is of interest to you, you can upvote the question. So we know that it's a question that is of interest to many people. So feel free to do that. And to do that, it's just going to be clicking on the thumbs up icon that you'll see at that point on your screen. If you want to reach out to the moderators, which is Gary and myself, feel free to use the chat box. So indicated by the blue arrow on your screen. So you would reach out to us if you have technical difficulties, or if you wanted the presentation to go a little slower, or if you wanted our presenter to repeat something. So if you want this kind of information from us, feel free to drop that in the chat, and more substantial questions in the Q&A box. This webinar is recorded and it will be posted in the Lake Champlain Sea Grant YouTube channel. So today's webinar, in this webinar today, you learn about how to avoid damage from flooding, and you learn about the Vermont Emergency Relief and Assistance Fund. But before we delve into the webinar, I wanted we do a quick poll, just to get a sense of your understanding of some of the material that we are going to present today. So just an initial understanding. So I'm going to launch the poll. It's just a couple of questions. So you should be able to see the questions on your screen. The first question is, how familiar are you with the benefits and requirements of Vermont's Emergency Relief and Assistance Fund? And the second question is, how familiar are you with the no adverse impact approach to floodplain management? So I'm going to give you another few seconds to answer these two questions, and then I'll stop the poll. Ten more seconds. Okay, so I'm going to end the poll here, and I'm going to share the results. So I'm hoping you can see the results here. So we have a mix for the first question about ERAF, a mix of people who are not at all familiar, a little bit familiar, somewhat familiar, and very familiar, so that's good. And about the same for no adverse impact. Quite a few of you are actually a little bit familiar. So thank you for sharing that. So now I am going to introduce our speaker. So it is my pleasure to introduce Ned Swanberg, who is the Flood Hazard Mapping Coordinator for the Rivers Program of the Vermont Agency of Natural Resources. He is also the Central Vermont Regional Floodplain Manager. And Ned is a certified floodplain manager and has a master's in environmental studies from Antioch University, New England. He uses the pronouns he or ki, and he lives along the north branch of the Winooski River. Ned, thank you so much for being here, and you have the floor. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so you can share yours. You can unmute yourself.
Thank you so much. I don't know, do you see the screen presentation launched yet?
Yeah, so we see your PowerPoint. Now, if you go into presentation mode, we should be able to see the full thing. This is, yeah, there we go.
Wonderful. I'm going to shut off my video as well, just to make sure that I don't have too many glitches here. Thank you. Thank you all for coming today. I just, there's a lot of things I would love to talk with you about. And because of the format, it's going to be hard to really get terribly far into the details in the context of the webinar, but please follow up with me. My email is here. It's also going to be in chat, and we'll follow up with a handout with a series of, I hope, useful links and my email contact information again as well. So thank you for being here. Floodreadyvermont.gov is a key website with a lot of basic information for communities around this extremely important question about how do we avoid damage from flooding. So please do visit there and take advantage of those resources. And the key thing is, what can we do to avoid increasing the risk to vulnerable residents and protect community services? And one of the key messages I want to bring to your attention today is that a big thing that's really important in Vermont is to be thinking about our streams and rivers and their hidden aspects, if you would. The fact that they actually do have functional floodplains and functional river corridors. And these two aspects, floodplains and river corridors, are key considerations in taking care of our streams and rivers and each other. So we're trying to, through our work in our communities, be protecting the room needed by the river and protecting the functions of floodplains, which protect all of us. And the key message I want to get across about the bylaws is that there are model no adverse impact bylaws available right now online, link to come. And the key elements in that is including both of those pieces: river corridor protection. And the key idea there is in this area that's identified close to streams and rivers, don't build any closer than what's already there. Give the room needed for the river to remain if it's still there. So far, we have functional room for rivers on a lot of streams and rivers, and we're trying to protect that function so it continues. And the related piece to that is special flood hazard areas, and in relationship to this area that gets wet during overbank flooding. We're trying to protect those areas and their functioning by not adding fill or net fill. And then when we're fixing up buildings that are already there, we're really trying to keep them high and dry and really be thinking about a strong standard of at least getting the lowest floor 2 feet above the flood water, the base flood elevation. So working together around these considerations, we'll talk more about this. So this is a slide that was composed a while ago, looking at data in Vermont about hazard events. And you can see that one of the major hazard events we're all quite aware of as we go into the winter are winter events with snow and ice, downed power lines. And then after that, we come up with other events such as wind events and severe weather, which are a mixture of things, but severe weather including also heavy rains in localized places, and then flooding and hurricanes and tornadoes and landslides, what have you. But in terms of the damage that happens in Vermont, the greatest amount of the cost to you and I, to all of us as local taxpayers, state taxpayers, federal taxpayers, is from the damage caused by flooding and severe weather, basically these big events that are basically driving losses through the power of moving water. This is a slide looking at the extent of claims made against the National Flood Insurance Program over time. And you can see that as it goes along, there's a lot of years where there's really not a lot of claims made against this insurance program for private structures. And then there's a little bump in the 90s and a bump in about 2002. And this all kind of continues along with a fairly steady pattern of dry years and wet years until 2011. And now I'm trying to see what happened to my screen. There we go. In which case we had a remarkable set of claims for the National Flood Insurance Program, completely off the scale at $53 million. So my screen is locking up on me here. There we go. I just pulled this off of the NOAA website earlier this week, and this is looking at billion-dollar disaster events across the country and categorized by flooding and severe storm and tropical and cyclone events and so forth. But again, you can look at this and see a pattern of increasingly costly disasters, flooding in the mix there, but also, you know, broken out by cyclones as well, and severe storms, which also in part characterized by heavy rainfalls in localized areas. So we can see a trend line here of increasing problems, and in part that's because of the things we're concerned about together, which is that there's more and more people in places that are hazardous, and more value in places that are hazardous. And perhaps in part, we're not being mindful of the systems and where the systems are going. So I think the most important thing I would say about how can we avoid damage from flooding and other sources is to avoid it, to not be there, to steer out of it, to use the data we have and do better planning about where we're going to end up. All right, let's go. Advanced slide, please. Yep, there we go. So actually this, yeah, there's a note basically that this was pulled down, of course, before Fiona hit Puerto Rico again following Marie, and of course Ian now at over $40 billion in expected costs. The National Flood Insurance Program has something around $11 billion at hand to cover costs for the insurance program. So how do we step down these risks? And in part, we do this by knowing what's out there and what's important. And again, let's be mindful of our river corridors and floodplains. Where are they and what's at risk already? We should be using this to inform our work. We need to be protecting what works and not aggravating the problem. So we need to know how floodplains function and work for us. And on that basis, how do we make sure that they are functioning and we don't compromise that ability that's being done right now for free by natural ecological services, by floodplains, and not making it harder for our neighbors and for our town roads, working toward keeping our roads intact and reducing the risk to existing structures. And from there, preparing for emergencies anyway, because we will have those. And finally, insurance for people that are already stuck in a high risk area, and insurance for the community that's facing a likelihood of increasing disasters as well. So each of these things is involved in stepping down the risk of damage from flooding and from known causes. But let's just kind of focus for a moment on the fact that floodplains are not just a problem. They have a variety of functions that are useful and important to us. They are basically the hidden aspect of the streams and rivers that store floodwater, that move floodwater and ice and debris and sediment through the landscape. So they have a function. We just need to remember that that's what's going on. Maybe not today, or maybe not during the drought, but this is a place of value to our community and our success together. They're also important to keep the water clean. They slow the water, trap the sediments and phosphorus instead of flowing into the lake. They're building and enriching the soil. They're helping to bring water and help to recharge the water supply in our gravel aquifers that underlie our places where we live. They're providing good space for agriculture and forestry, recreation, beauty. They're places of tremendous value for wildlife and natural communities. And the other thing is, again, functionally, they're reducing flood levels through the system, how high it gets at each stage as it goes down the valley, and the power of that moving water, which causes so much damage. So in Vermont, flooding is widespread. It's a part of our landscape. This is not the Mojave. It's natural, it's expected, it's common, and it doesn't need to be a disaster. So here's just a quick shot. You probably remember after Tropical Storm Irene, the huge amounts of sediment that were sent off into Lake Champlain to cause adverse impacts with phosphorus loading and cyanobacteria and algal problems in the lake. Same thing happened in Long Island Sound, coming down the Connecticut River as well. Here, sediment-laden water on the Otter Creek, in this case, flooding out over a huge, mostly forested floodplain and agricultural fields, and trapping those sediments in places that do not end up as much into the lake. So really a big sediment trap, a huge stormwater sediment system. And in the graph in the lower right, you can see Otter Creek flowing from south to north and up into the lake, and two red spots showing gauges on the flow along the Otter Creek. And on the right, this blue band shows that the water from Tropical Storm Irene peaked really rapidly in Rutland, in West Rutland at the gauge, and then tapered off. And that huge peak meant that the water depth and the power was higher and hence more destructive at that level of impact. But then in Middlebury downstream, where more water would be showing up eventually, the peak didn't show up for several more days. And when it did, it slowly rose, never got that high, and slowly tapered. And that's all because of the intervention of this floodplain wetland complex between Rutland and Middlebury. So a very dramatic function of floodplains is to reduce peaks and power of flooding systems. Looking across the state right now, pulling up E911 points in known special flood hazard areas, there are people across the state that have ended up with buildings in high-risk zones, probably over 12,000 buildings now. This is data from Bennington County, where we have fairly good data on the quality of the flood maps. And it's really almost 1,000 structures, 900 structures in Bennington County alone, including 680 families that are in high-risk zones and would probably face tremendous costs and displacement and other kinds of misfortunes having been affected by flood events because of the location of their building or home. So right now in Vermont, we have a series of different flood maps that we're working from, quite a mixture. In the upper left, we can see the flood hazard boundary map, which is a feature that comes out first when communities are being offered the opportunity to be in the National Flood Insurance Program. Lower left, we have a flood insurance rate map, which is what typically is available to communities in the program. And then sometimes communities get a detailed study and a floodway map showing an area with higher velocities and protected right-of-way for floodwaters through the community during flood events. And then finally, a few communities, almost half the communities in the state, now have a digital version of that, digital flood insurance rate map, or DFIRM, with much easier to use outcomes, including aerial photographs in the background, and you can actually see buildings and understand the relative risk in the community. So this is a much easier map to use, certainly, than the flood hazard boundary maps that are still in effect in a number of communities in Vermont today, where you very seldom can even find a landmark to measure from, to plot your location and understand your risk. So bit by bit, the map quality is improving for us. Here's a quick look at a DFIRM, a digital flood insurance rate map. And on it, you can see that in this case, it's from the Flood Ready Atlas, links to come. But the red area actually shows you the extent of the special flood hazard area, or zone AE, the area that the community takes responsibility for to participate in the National Flood Insurance Program. Also zone A and zone AO and AH, sometimes, rarely in Vermont. Inside of this area, you can see the hatch marks. So a bunch of different things. So here's the channel, in this case, of the river. This is the zone AE, special flood hazard area, and zone A off to the bottom left corner, shown in an amber color. And then we have I think I just there we go. I think we're back on. Let me know if I'm not back on.
Yeah, you're good. You're good,
Oh,
Ned.
good. All right. I'm trying to chase this menu bar around the screen. So we also have features like the floodway, this hatch mark, and cross sections that give us information about how high the water is, how high the base flood is expected to be as it moves down the valley, in this case, flowing north. From 542.7 to 542.1 as it heads north and ultimately west into the Hudson and the Atlantic. So this is all information available to us on the firms with a detailed study and on the DFIRMs with a detailed study. So in Vermont, we went through a wave of map updates to come up with DFIRMs, digital flood insurance rate maps, in mostly the southern part of the state. And then the whole process from FEMA stalled out as there was a lot of considerations of budgets and priorities and working with Congress, trying to reform the NFIP. And anyway, suddenly, Region 1, I'm sorry, the FEMA office for Vermont has figured out that Vermont's maps were still really not up to date at all, and they've returned with gangbusters to update the maps across the state. So in this image on the left, you can see that there's a lot of work going on all across the state. The darker blue areas are most advanced in the process, and in the southwest, the Hudson, Hoosick basin areas are the last to be involved, but they're underway right now. So all these things are happening. On the right, you can see that what these maps are coming together bit by bit, watershed by watershed, but later on, they're going to come back to the community county by county. And so as the county gets ready, the community will be engaged to look at the draft work maps and to become ready to adopt the new maps, and also to make corrections and so forth in that process. If looking at the data that's coming from the contractors, we're looking at a lot of work in the next handful of years. So right now, we're looking at probably countywide work maps coming out first in the northwestern corner of the state with the Missisquoi, so Franklin County, Orleans County, Grand Isle, that area, all coming together perhaps with countywide work maps this winter that we will be able to look at and critique, make corrections where needed and so forth. And then this summer being followed by a number of other counties. Now, we don't know if it's going to go down this way, but this is the best we can figure out based on the process underway. And chances are these things will be bumped back as we go along, but we don't know. And, to the extent that we have events like Fiona and Ian and all the FEMA staff get pulled off to do disaster recovery, those things tend to slow up their ability to move forward with new mapping and help with the process of avoiding hazards. So chances are things will go a little bit slower than this, but this is the general timeline we have. A lot going on. So with those maps that are available and being updated, the key message that they try to provide is, where is the water going to be pooling? Where is the water going to be arriving in the community, and how high will it be? And so the key thing under the National Flood Insurance Program, in the insurance program, is to avoid paying out money. They don't want to pay for new claims for flood damage. And so every way possible, they're asking communities to adopt a minimum set of requirements to make sure that as development goes forward, it's safer from flood damage. And so there's a whole series of concerns, mostly focused on individual buildings and making sure that individual buildings are more safe from damage and avoid costs to the program that drive up the cost of insurance, that make it harder to be involved and access the program, and harder for the families, that need the money to. They're trying to make sure that people can get the money by making the whole thing workable. And there's a problem with this model, as you might guess. But some of the basic ideas here are, you could take, in the upper right, you can see the key ideas to elevate the lowest floor so that it can't get wet. So again, the key idea in the model no adverse impact bylaws is to say, keep that lowest floor very high, at least 2 feet above the floodwater, because floodwater doesn't come in according to the map. Floodwater comes in more frequently at a lower level, sometimes at a much higher level. And the higher you are, the less likely you'll be damaged from what's known or unknown about the flooding in your situation. It also affects the basement. So in a flood zone, really, there's no place to, you don't want to have a hole in the ground with your water heater and your furnace and your electric panel, because that's the first place the water goes and causes the greatest amount of damage. So the basic rule in a flood zone is no basement. You elevate all these things you love above the flood water. Another common opportunity here on the upper left is, can you not be there by design, by planning to not end up in a place where you are facing flood risks and paying insurance? Or if you're already there, how can you be possibly relocated out of it? Or sometimes it's possible to acquire the structure and simply use this as an opportunity to turn this into functional floodplain space, and reduce the risk to the insurance program, reduce the risk to the community, and hopefully make incremental gains in floodplain function. Again, the same thing happens for, elevating utilities of all different types. And on the bottom center, you can see this flood opening. It's a basic idea about no basement, but again, with a garage or a barn or a non-working space, you can have an accessory building where the water goes, or even underneath the residence. You can have a situation where the water goes in and the water goes out. And so the foundation does not get damaged by the hydrostatic pressure on the outside of the foundation, which could crush the foundation and take the house down as a unit. So hazard mitigation assistance is another branch of opportunity provided by FEMA, and in this case in Vermont through the Vermont Emergency Management Program. And there's money available, particularly around acquisition of 12,000 structures that are in the high risk area already. It doesn't mean that all these things are easy decisions to make. It doesn't mean that it's necessarily going to make you whole, but it might keep a lot of harm out of the way for you and your family. But it's something that can be done. And there also has been a lot of effort at finding ways of matching the FEMA money through the Hazard Mitigation Assistance Program with other funds to make it increasingly accessible to people that need to think about a safer place at this time. So the base flood elevation question is basically, how high is the water going to come? And how do we make sure that everything we love is above that level of the water? But that is not always the problem. And in Vermont, a lot of the problem is not from how high the water comes, but from how powerful the water is when it arrives. In this case, causing tremendous erosion, leaving the building high and dry and totally unworkable. So this is the really bigger problem in high gradient systems of streams and rivers, such as in Vermont, and especially where the river has been directed by development over time and riprap and channelization to become constrained and more powerful and more damaging as it goes down the river system. So the most of the damage that happens in Vermont in particular happens to all of us, again, as municipal, state, and federal taxpayers. And in the lower right, you see on this pie graph from an earlier selection I was able to make, and I haven't been able to update this recently, but I will. But 2003, 2008, we're looking at declared public disaster losses. That's public losses, mostly due to losses on roads, bridges, and culverts. And these are losses by municipalities and the state, but also in other places around the country at the county level. And then the smaller wedge at 5% are actually claims by the National Flood Insurance Program, under the insurance program for losses to private structures. And so again, most of the outcomes in flooding related events affect all of us. It's not just the people that are living too close to the river. And the 5% is not representative of all the losses for the people by the river either, or by the lake, because a lot, as you'll notice in other slides, a lot of people are not carrying flood insurance. And we don't know what their losses were and what happened. And a lot of people are not carrying sufficient flood insurance for their situation. And so a lot of this is also unknown and poorly represented. But on the right, you can see dots of claims for help under public assistance from the federal government after federally declared disasters affecting municipalities basically across the state. And so this is a real important thing for all of us. So why not just build higher with fill in the floodplain? Why don't we just fill it in and go on with our business? So top screen, you can see a house not so far away from the channel during flood stage. And at the bottom, a new building comes in, big fill pad and new buildings with beautiful view of the river. And when it floods, the water is displaced in part downstream and part onto neighbors. People that were just out are no longer just out. People that were just in are in deeper. And so by adding fill, we're basically barring the function of the floodplain. We're creating a situation where the flood water can't be there and it's being displaced onto others. And so how do we avoid this situation that aggravates the risk to our neighbors, aggravates the risk to our culvert down the stream a little bit, and the town roads and the town bridges all the way down the system? So how do we avoid losses due to flooding? As a household, we can make a plan and we can practice the plan. We can get flood insurance. We can get other insurance. We can build up a reservoir of extra money. I haven't done that yet myself. It's very hard to always do. We could also elevate the structure in the nick of time or relocate the structure ahead of the problem. Again, nothing about that is convenient and easy. It's possible, it's important, but that's really hard, slow work. And that's the sort of work that communities can pick away at, in particular by doing good education and outreach under their hazard mitigation plans. At the community level, we can adopt regulations to avoid known hazard areas, such as floodplains and river corridors, and not be aggravating the risk to structures and families and assets, town assets like roads already in the hazard zone. And we can be taking steps to incrementally reduce the existing exposure. Very slow, very hard, much more expensive. We could be improving emergency response capacity for the people that are going to need it. So, and at the state and federal level, we can be developing the data to identify the inundation risks and erosion risks, providing model regulations and incentives, such as the ERAF program, to help communities adopt stronger standards to avoid known risks. So disaster is not necessary. We can have flooding and floodplains, and it's not a disaster. It could just be another interesting day. Looking at these, you can see that actually these are tracing out channels over time. On the left, this is an aerial photograph with different years in which the position of Lewis Creek has been traced out on old photographs. And you can see that it, even though it's mostly kind of the same, it's always kind of different. It's always cutting and depositing and shifting the shape of these meanders bit by bit across the valley. And so how do we put this kind of information together so at a community level, we can stay out of the way and we can allow Lewis Creek to make these incremental shifts with its energy and water and sediment, and not try to get in there and wrestle with the river for the rest of our lives and the rest of the river's life, which will be around for much longer than any of us, for sure. On the right, you can see the same thing on the Little River, the third branch, all of these different systems. You can see that there's incremental changes in the position of the channel. And we're trying to capture this information to inform these river corridor maps. Here's another image from a relative elevation model derived from the LIDAR elevation data statewide. This is the New Haven River, and you can see some of the hidden landscape. The river is in one place now, but you can see where it's been in many different places over time across this valley. And so we can use this information to inform future development in our communities. So does elevating the building by itself avoid the problem, such as you would do under the National Flood Insurance Program? It helps, but it's not actually solving the key problem in Vermont. In this map and this diagram, you can see a series of different stages of the channel evolving over time. So in the upper spot, we see a house that's been placed too close to the river. And it looks like a great spot, but then it gets flooded. And so there's damage, and the response is to create some sort of bank armoring and maybe to elevate the house a little bit to keep it there. But basically that causes the energy in the stream and the channel when it fills to not be able to be expressed and to move the channel laterally, but it causes it to dig down deeper. And as it digs down deeper and in sizes, eventually it gets so deep that the bank fails and the house goes in, or the road fails again and falls down the bank, and you can't get to town, or you can't get home, or the school bus is stuck. So by trying to protect this lateral space near the channel of the stream and the river, we're giving the ability of that stream and river the adequate room to shift back and forth slowly to handle the water, sediment, and energy, and to stay out of the way wherever we can, so that we don't have these deepening channels and failing banks. So there's a vicious cycle that sets up in a lot of situations that we're trying to find our way out of. There's big flows, maybe it's flooding, or maybe it's just high water and it causes some flooding, some erosion, maybe there's injury and damage. And then the tendency is to try to fix it right by your house by, basically armoring the bank, maybe doing some filling or berming. All these things are done in location by location to try to protect this and protect that. And as we do those little patches of fixes, they all basically become barriers to the function of the floodplain overall. And they're pushing the water and the energy onto our neighbors, or again, the culvert or the road just downstream. So we're trying to find a way to get out of this positive feedback loop with bad outcomes, this vicious cycle, by planning, by choosing to develop in a more appropriate place that's not so close. And so we're using good thinking about how to avoid building new stuff into river corridors, identifying safer places, and places where we can have walkable communities that can be protected and accessible to everybody. And all of our communities and regional planning commissions and the state have developed flood resilience plans. And they're all about how do we do this together. So your town is not alone. We're all trying to work toward this together. And this is a key part of the strategy. So don't be building closer to the river than what's already there within the river corridor. And so, we're going to expect things to change, sometimes slowly, sometimes catastrophically. We're trying to stay out of the way. The river corridor, as it's mapped online at the A&R Atlas or the Flood Ready Atlas, and in your community as well, it includes this area that includes the meander pattern, this meander belt of the channel, where we see this basically same amplitude over time is protected and available to the river or the channel. And it also includes area for a stable bank nearby. So we could have habitat, trees, and we don't have somebody so close that they insist on putting riprap way out in the middle of the meander belt to protect it, protect the house and the garage and the wastewater system from the movement of the channel. So we're trying to keep things set back enough that people don't insist on diminishing the meander pattern. So when we have the whole thing set up right, we end up with a river corridor that functions. If we don't, we end up with houses sprinkled all the way down the valley, in enjoying the views and the access to the road, and basically each one of them protecting themselves against the river one by one, and restricting and straightening the river, forcing it to become deeper, more powerful, and destructive. With a river corridor protected, we're trying to, again, create a space to tolerate the incremental changes in the sinuosity, the meander pattern of the channel over time. And that allows the river, again, with its energy, water, sediment, debris, to pick the slowest and least erosive path down the river. Doesn't require us to be out there with bulldozers and excavators. The river will do it itself if we've allowed it to have the space that the river needs. So the other thing I want to mention really is that we have an opportunity now with the flood maps coming to be thinking about our community in relationship to how we're going to live with the rivers and streams in our community. And the state now has a no adverse impact model to consider in relationship to floodplains and river corridors. Just a quick look at the table, or the table of contents. It's online now. I'll send the link out later, and the model can be incorporated into your language. It can be edited, but it's setting up a high standard of trying to avoid hazard areas and avoid aggravating the problem. So again, the key elements are within the river corridor as mapped or identified. Don't build any closer than what's already there. If there's already something there, It's already been diminished, but don't get any closer than that. And no net fill in the special flood hazard area. So maybe there has to be a little bit here, a little bit there, but we take some out over there and nearby here. And so we're not clogging up what is currently functional space for floodwater during flood events and forcing it on down the valley into the village and into the towns below. And the other element that I would just point out is substantial improvements. And that's kind of a curious thing that's buried in the insurance program. But basically it says, if you're one of those 12,000 structures that's already in the high risk area, the bylaws require that at some point, if the structure is getting a lot of new money putting into it, and we're going to do new counters and new windows and a bump out kitchen, at some point, the town regulations need to say, there's so much money going into this building that it has to become flood safe. And so it really requires at that point that you reorder your priorities about what you're doing, and the flood safe element is part of the package. And that basically typically means that you're elevating the lowest floor above the floodwater, and the standard that is recommended in the bylaw is at least 2 feet above that base flood elevation that's available. And that will create a much safer outcome and a less costly insurance outcome. Affordable insurance is possible.
Ned, may I interrupt for a minute?
Yeah, please.
It's 12:49 and I want to keep at least 5 minutes for questions. So just, to make you aware of the time.
Thank you. Maybe I'll go a couple, 3 slides to be sure I'm covering ERAF stuff.
Yeah,
and then we'll kind
good.
of circle back and make sure that we're picking up questions and stuff.
Sounds good.
Thank you so much. So for ERAF, for the Emergency Relief and Assistance Fund, which is an insurance program for the towns, it basically creates a benefit for communities that are avoiding new encroachments into the river corridor. And the key idea is adopting a no adverse impact standard for the areas that are mapped, and for small streams that are more than a half square mile watershed, and to provide at least those small streams with a 50-foot setback from the top of bank in the real world. So those are the key elements coming into the ERAF standard. In this case, you can see with the river corridor, the no adverse impact standard can allow things. Here's the river channel, here's the river corridor extent, and there's already a house here. And so you can allow another house perhaps nearby, behind it, or just downstream of it within 50 feet. And that would be an acceptable place to consider putting another house, which would make things no worse for the river than what's already there. So actually, in this case, here's the house, and it could allow something behind or downstream. In this case, this is a septic system, and you could allow something behind or downstream, assuming that this is all going to have to be protected by huge boulders under permit anyway at tremendous expense. And the other place that is possible within the river corridor is to say, here are 2 houses that are already there, and it's so close between them, within 300 feet, that there's no way the river can go in there and out of there in a meander bend that makes any sense. It'd just be so crazy and so much riprap to accommodate that. It's lost already. And so to some degree within this space, you could also build between those 2 buildings with new infill structures without making it any worse for the river. So the ERAF program, to circle back to that, thank you, is again this opportunity for communities to take action ahead of time, to avoid making flood risks worse, and to get more support after publicly, federally declared disasters. So right now, any community that's in Vermont after a disaster is entitled to get a lot of help from the federal taxpayers, that's us, who will pick up basically 75% of the community's losses, eligible losses after a disaster. And then the state will pick up an additional 7.5%, and the community will pick up 17.5% of the total budget. So if it was $1 million expense, it still might be something that is the equivalent of a couple of town positions. If the community is taking action to reduce flood risk by being involved in the National Flood Insurance Program, having an emergency operations plan in place, having a local hazard mitigation plan in place, and having road and bridge standards in place, then the state will split the loss. So again, the federal taxpayers will typically pick up 75%. And in this case, the remainder is still a big chunk of money. And the state, through ERAF, Emergency Relief and Assistance Fund, will pick up half the cost. And if the community goes on to pick up also river corridor protection on top of that, the state will pick up the 17.5%. So leaving the smallest portion for the town taxpayers. And so the hope is that towns will think about avoiding risks for the benefits of the people that live there, and for the equity issues for people who will get damaged, to be thinking about caring for streams and rivers. But there's also this built-in incentives that really kind of helps to say, you know, if the town is willing to take steps to avoid damage, the state will take steps to help support the town as well. So let me stop on and be sure that I'm catching up with some of the questions that might be popping up. And otherwise, I do have more slides I'd be happy to share. So thank you.
Thank you, Ned. We do have a question. What is the best way to access the River Corridors GIS layer? I can't seem to find it on BCGI's data portal. From Stephanie Magnin. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name, Stephanie.
Yeah, thank you, Stephanie. So the river corridor data is buried out there as GIS data. So that's hard. Maybe we could follow up later if you want to have it incorporated into your GIS. And I can set you up with the point to bring it into your data. It's also visible, you probably know, on the Agency of Natural Resources Atlas and on the Flood Ready Atlas. So it's visible in both those places. So I hope that helps. Yeah.
Thank you, Ned. So if you have any questions for Ned, now is a good time to write them down in the Q&A. Oh, we have a big one that's coming. Okay. Okay, can you see it, Ned? I'm going to read it out loud.
Yeah, would you please? Yeah, go ahead and read it. Yeah.
So we had a large FEMA project from April 2019 rain event, around 300,000 of eligible damage. I presented data to our select board showing how the costs were covered under FEMA and the 12.5% ERAF rate for our town. The interesting piece was that having river corridor protections would have saved taxpayers another $12,900. Up to this point, we have had severe resistance by property owners who do not want to be told what they can or cannot do with their land. We are a zoning-free town. I think it was effective to show that a portion of our taxpayer were costing those who did not own near a river. I am not sure it will change anything, but I think the financial impact needs to be stressed.
Thank you, Jan, very much. That's the value in part of the ERAF incentive is to help, provide some visible monetary numeric values to the select board and the community when they're wrestling with these issues. And a lot of times, when we're at these meetings at the town level, there'll be a landowner that might stand up and say, I don't want you to get in my way. I have big intentions and plans and I don't care about the rest of you. Basically, I want to do what I want with my piece. And I'm going to pretend it doesn't have any effects on anybody else, which of course is not actually the case. But by using the numbers from ERAF and showing that there is a backup and insurance opportunity for the community, that may help people also realize that as a select board member, I don't want to be holding the bag when the flood comes, when the disaster comes, and the bill comes following. I want to show that I've done due diligence and I've done the best I can for my community, and everybody will appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you, Ned. We have a question in the chat from Rosella. Is there anyone to come talk to our planning commission?
Yeah, I think that's actually what's going on right now is, again, there are new maps coming all across the state. All the towns really need to be engaged in this process of dialogue. We're going to be trying to prioritize the counties that are most likely to come up first. So watch for that. We're trying to reach out to regional planning commission staff members and try funding to help them support towns. But in the meantime, yes, absolutely. Drop me a line. I would be happy to talk with you. Sometimes somebody from the Regional Planning Commission could talk. Sometimes the regional floodplain manager that I work with could be the right person to come. And sometimes I might be able to be available to talk, although I really would rather do it online than be driving all around the state right now. So especially looking at over 200 communities that are going to go through this process. So yes, drop me a line. I'd be happy to talk with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We have what's probably going to be our last question because we are almost to the hour. Susanna asks, our town implemented buffers on all mapped streams many years ago. There was a lot of resistance, but most people came around to believe that we had done the right thing. We recently put language around river corridors and so forth into our new regulations.
Wonderful, wonderful. A lot of communities have begun doing this, working with it. I know Calais right now has it coming up on the ballot. So there's every community that picks this up and moves it along is really helpful. I'm really hoping that as communities think about it, and really think hard about where it's going, that they're going to take the right action, just like your community. So thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I just put Ned's contact information in the chat. We are to the hour, so we're going to have to stop here. I would like to thank Ned for a very insightful presentation, and I would like to thank everyone for attending, for making the time to be with us today. You will receive as a follow-up email the PDFs of the slides that you saw today, a link to the recording, and a list of links that Ned wanted to share with you. So you're going to get that. I wanted to take this opportunity to mention that the recording of our last webinar is on our YouTube channel. I encourage you to check it out. Stephanie Smith she's the State Hazard Mitigation Officer, talked about funding flood resilience through a couple of FEMA programs and the Flood Resilient Communities Fund. So it's a nice complement to today's presentation. We're still working on our next webinar. We do not have a date yet, but stay tuned. The topic will be on managing grants. So with that, thank you again, and I wish you a great rest of your day. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Ned. Bye.